everyone, Jasmine here. One of the hardest things about making this show was all of the things that I didn't get to include in the podcast. To make this show, I went through hundreds of hours of tape and recordings and interviews. And there were so many details and stories that got cut for time, and experts that I wanted to spend more time with in the podcast. So in this episode, you'll hear from one of the experts that we heard from in episode 9, Roberto Lovato, who gave us an overview of how MS-13 began in California. Roberto is a professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and he was a huge source of inspiration for me in making this show, because he went on a very similar journey to mine in writing his memoir, Unforgetting. In his book, Roberto traced his own family's story across the generations in El Salvador. And he shared some of that story with me. Check it out. And so you said your family migrated in the 40s and 50s. Mm-hmm. When you were growing up, did your family talk about their life in El Salvador and their immigration story?
Yeah. My abuelita Mama Te was the first to migrate. She grew up, she raised my dad in San Salvador most of the time before they were in the rural areas of Ahuachapán and in the city of Ahuachapán. And then they migrated to the city after La Matanza of 1932. My dad was then a 9-year-old boy. And my Mama Te was a seamstress and a loner.
And La Matanza is something that I wanted to get into in this series, and I never found the right place to talk about it. But for anyone who isn't aware of what it is, can you give us a brief overview?
Yeah, you have to remember this is during the Great Depression when you have genocides in Ukraine, in Haiti, and other parts of the world that are poor. And so the Great Depression and the shifts to the global economy as it started moving away from agricultural life into industrial life displaced and destroyed indigenous and other communities throughout the world. And so in El Salvador, the coffee economy was the great destroyer of indigenous life. Before La Matanza, thousands upon thousands of indigenous children and adults were dying for lack of food, lack of water. And eventually you say, well, screw this. I'm going to revolt. It was actually the first modern revolutionary movement in the Americas. Right, was organized like that. But the story is that a guy named Farabundo Martí, the traditional story is that he led the revolution. And so this is how the indigenous Pipil Nahuatl peoples in Izalco and Ahuachapán organized themselves. And thousands of them revolted. And in the response of the state by a dictator, Maximiliano Hernández Martínez, was to wipe out something on the order of 10 to 15, all the way up to maybe 30 to 40,000. We still don't know. I've gone to the mass graves. The bodies are still there in Izalco, in Ahuachapán. And so I've talked to scholars at Oxford who study global violence. And those scholars told me that in terms of the number of people killed in one place, in a concentrated space and concentrated time, in modern history, you have things like World War II, World War I, and then at the top of the graph, there's this little speck. And guess what that speck is? El Salvador, 1932, is arguably, I'm told by these Oxford scholars, was arguably the single most violent episode in modern history. I don't even have the words for the weight that I felt upon me and on my soul because of that, especially given that I myself had an experience of violence and war.
Well, and there's so many echoes of that moment in the storytelling of the Civil War, right? The fact that the FMLN is named after Farabundo Martí, despite the fact that that initial uprising in 1932 wasn't really a communist uprising. It was an uprising of indigenous peoples trying to better their living conditions. And it just happened to fall under this sort of umbrella of communism, right? Like communist revolts were happening around the world. The Bolshevik Revolution is happening around the same time, but it's not necessarily a communist revolution, but that's just sort of the color that all of these revolutions get painted with.
I mean,
and then you see the echoes of that in the Civil War.
Yes, yes. You see the narration of what happened, very different and told from a non-indigenous perspective. However, it was in part a communist rebellion. There was some coordination in some places, and there were indigenous people who had incorporated into the Socorro Rojo, which was the communist structure of the moment in El Salvador. And, people in El Salvador were in touch with people in the Soviet Union and Mexico and organized an international kind of communist struggle. So it was in part, but the majority of the people that revolted were indigenous and, people who had complex reasons for revolting.
Well, and there's really an erasure of these indigenous stories throughout Salvadoran history. And, there's undertones of racism within all of these conflicts. I think there were several death squads in the Civil War, La Mano Blanca, Roberto Lovato's death squad, which was named after Maximiliano Hernandez, the dictator who ordered the massacre in 1932, right? Like, these names are not accidents. They are meant to invoke fear, and specifically the memory and the fear for these indigenous communities that were wiped out.
For the indigenous communities, but also for those of us that revolted against the Salvadoran state in the late 20th century. I have the dubious distinction of being persecuted by Escuadrones de la Muerte, including the Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez death squad in El Salvador and in the United States, in Los Angeles, where the death squads were operating. And you can find this in the LA Times. The LA Times reported, I believe Hector Tobar, when he was at the LA Times, and others reported on this network of Salvadoran death squad operatives that were persecuting us, shooting at us in the streets of LA, and capturing people, including women who were raped and tortured. This is why I wrote my book. That's why I call it Unforgetting, because a lot of the work of terror is to force people to forget. And when you forget the bad things, the tragic thing is that you also forget the good things. And really, my point of my book is to remember the bad things in order to also get at the beauty and the sublime and the powerful things that push some of us to adopt a dream of revolutionary struggle.
Well, and it feels like we continually relive the past. I was looking at quotes from Alfredo Cristiani, who immediately after the war starts saying, well, we should really stop looking back, and we really need to leave the past in the past, and we need to move forward and move on. And it feels like in the current moment, President Bukele is saying, well, the past is a past, and we need to look at the future, which is why I think your book is so important, because these stories do die because they don't get told. And I think it is a common theme within Salvadorans in particular that we are not taught our histories. So can you talk a little bit about your inspiration for writing the book?
Yeah, there are a number of inspirations for me writing my book. I don't know how other people work about it. Some people have one motive. I had different motives. One of the motives, the initial motive was, you see in the beginning of the book, I go to an immigrant prison that is euphemistically called a detention center, right? Where you have children and mothers being jailed, separated from each other by the tens of thousands. As early as 2011, actually, I was documenting this, but some of my editors would not publish it. You want to know why? Because a lot of those editors are liberal Democrats. And who was president in 2011 when the mass incarceration, mass separation of Central American children begins?
Right. Well, that's, people have a lot of mixed feelings about Obama. He was really the deporter in chief for quite a long time.
I'll be giving a speech or a talk somewhere at university or Harvard or somewhere. And, I'll say, how many of you believe Donald Trump is a fascist because he caged, jailed, and separated Central American children as young as 4 years old from their mothers? How many of you believe that's fascistic? almost every hand goes up like a Pledge of Allegiance in kindergarten. Then I pivot, I say, well, how many of you would say Barack Obama was a fascist when he did, and he began the practice by the tens of thousands as early as 2011? And I do have the receipts. I'm a journalist. That's what we do as investigative journalists. You bring receipts. Hardly any hands will go up, and you get these awkward. So that awkwardness is in the university, that awkwardness is in the editorial, that awkwardness is in your newspaper that erases Barack Obama's nefarious contributions to the destruction of Central American life. Erasure has profound implications. I'm glad you're talking about it, because something I learned from the war in El Salvador is that you need to erase people's humanity in order to kill them. There's something about looking at somebody, and if you see him as a human, it's hard to pull the trigger. So erasure of memory and replacing it with, just look at like what's happening with Palestine right now. It's obvious that, you want to say history begins October 7th so that you can justify the genocide against Palestinians. And if you look at what happens to Palestinian bodies before that, it speaks for itself. But also look at what happens to the image of the Palestinian prior to October 7th. It was denigrated and destroyed in global media. And so as a Salvadoreño, I'm like, oh yeah, I know this one. They try to do that to me, and they try to kill me, right? Even when I wasn't in the FMLN, or at least not publicly about it. So, there's a theorist, she's kind of a liberal, but I still kind of like some of her stuff. Hannah Arendt. She's a philosopher whose most famous book is on totalitarianism. It's a standard book in political science. And she had some really interesting and sometimes profound things to say, including like seeing memory as a theater of political battle. You have to fight it out in the theater of memory so that the present can be psychically, you can arm people in the psychic present to be able to carry on a struggle. And so when I came for a title of my book, I wanted to make a contribution to the fight against fascism that was already clear to me when I wrote it in 2015. The book is really about, and I don't say it in directly, but the book is really about what I call the tenderness that survives the terror. There is a terror that we carry in our families and in the state, and in different places, and we lose the touch with the tenderness in ourselves.
After the break, Roberto tells me about reporting on the gangs in El Salvador and a standoff with the Salvadoran police. Yesterday, I was talking to Terry Carl, who is a scholar and a professor.
I know Terry.
She's fantastic. I completely fell in love with her. But we were talking about how the war not only dehumanized the victims, but also the perpetrators, and how the violence on both sides really, there was trauma on both sides when you're committing violence and when you're on the receiving end of violence. And there's a passage in your book that really chilled me. And it's the story that you tell about the cab driver, who was a member of the military. And I'm wondering if you can just give us a quick overview of that story.
Yeah, I changed his name to Isaias. So Isaias, was a guy I met through my cousin. I told her, I'm going to go to some scary ass places, right? And so she understood what I meant, and she got me this guy, Isaias, who was ex-military. Because I was going to interview top-level, mid-level, and low-level MS-13 and 18th Street members in rural areas, in hideouts in urban areas, in suburban areas. And so, we had the police as well, who are not exactly choir boys. So, Isaias, like any trained military person, has these qualities that are actually, like, for me as a journalist, helpful. He's always on time, like a clock. And most importantly, very loyal. He and I went to mass grave sites in gang controlled areas. We went to places where gangs came out, started getting ready to shoot at us, and we just, we booked it before getting into a gunfight with them. And so, like, all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's a scene in my book where I go to mass gravesite, and then I return to the camp because you gotta drive to a camp and then hike for an hour and a half to 2 hours to go to places where there's like this layered history of mass murder and mass graves where the gang killings and victims were buried on top of places where death squads were taking people.
Right. You don't need to do metaphors. Like it's literally history on top of history on top of history of these mass murders in El Salvador.
Yeah, that's why I've actually traveled across the entire continent going to mass grave sites, including like Iguala, Mexico, and Colombia and other places, because mass graves show a lot. So anyway, I'm at this mass grave site. I hike back. Isaias is waiting for me. He says, "Hey, boss, let's go. Let's go. Let's go." I'm saying, no, I have to say bye to the police and the forensics people that brought me. So in the forensics people, I didn't listen to Isaias. And then the forensic people just say, "Hey, bye, later," boom, and they left. An FMLN attorney, this is the electoral period. This is not the heroic era of the FMLN that I belong to. This is the post-war election FMLN. Two different entities that I wanted to make clear in the book. So
right, they become politicians, and
many, not everybody, but many did, and corruptos to boot. So then the lawyer walks up to me and says, you're going to erase your pictures. And I had just come back from this scary ass place at the mass graves where there's, cops and military, there's military tanks and heavily armed gang members duking it out. So this lawyer is forcing me to erase my pictures. And I got mad. I said, hell no. And then she had the police that were protecting me on the journey to the mass gravesite bring their guns and surround me at gunpoint and I said, well, you guys fucking erase it. I'm not going to help you. I can be kind of angry sometimes. Not like I used to be, but I was angry because I took a risk of my life only to have them erase my work product, what I risked my life for. So then they forced me to erase the pictures. Isaias was trying to protect me from that. So then, I've known him for a couple of years. I've had dinner with his kid and his wife, played soccer with them. And he was a genuinely decent person to me in the time that I knew him. And then we're at Mr. Donuts, right, which is a Salvadoran franchise. It's coffee and food. They have good food actually too, but
yeah, it's like a Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah, it's like Dunkin' Donuts. And it was actually where we would have Comando Urbano meetings that I actually put in the book as well. We'd have clandestine meetings at Mr. Donuts about planning offensives and stuff. So, I'm at Mr. Donut and I'm with Isaias, and he's telling me, hey, boss, I see you're doing stories. I have stories. Like, what do you mean? And he starts telling me stuff about he was in the army and he was in special forces, and, he was he was a capable guy. I mean, when we'd be like about to have a fucking shootout with the gangs, he would get this like laugh that I know. It's a nervous laugh in danger. The guy, he knew how to deal in danger. And he saved my life, literally, and looked out for me. And then he tells me he was in the military and special forces and that he had actually killed a guy that I probably knew in Chalatenango. And that he was in something called Sección 2, at which point my fate, because if he was in the military, okay, man, you were in the military. But Sección 2 was the official name of the Escuadrones de la Muerte. It's where they operated. And at that point, I'm like, but I want to bring the reader on that journey because it shows you the moral quagmire that is Salvadoran culture and life. Like, here's a guy who had all these qualities and he did all these things for me, but in a previous life, he was my enemy. What do I do?
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, El Salvador is such a tiny country.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's related to everybody. Everybody knows everybody. You know, you can't, whether it's on the FMLN or on the military side, like everybody is mixed in. And the amnesty law that is passed after the Civil War means that all of these guys go free.
Yeah.
You know, all of these crimes go unpunished and everyone's impugned. And so it really sets the stage for what comes after, because these guys have had their humanity robbed from them in their military training, in the things that they've been asked to do for the state. You know, it really goes back to this thing that one of the Jesuits of La UCA talked about, Ignacio Martín Baró, the militarization of the mind, right? It's a country that is collectively traumatized and now is asked to move forward as if nothing has happened. The thing that I think that I've come away from this whole journey understanding is that when you don't know and understand your history, you really repeat it, not in the exact same way, but in different ways. It's the same story playing out over and over again. It's the same characters. They just have different faces and different names.
Well put. My life is a testament to that. I was in a clique, you know, and I did violent things and I didn't know why, because I didn't know my history. And I learned my history little by little, and then I channeled the energy in a way that took me to the greatest adventures of life that I'm still living, which is being in a revolutionary journey, being in a truth-telling journey as a journalist, and now being in a different kind of truth-telling as a author. You know, I'm still optimistic and hopeful, and despite everything I've seen. So yeah, what Harent told us about fighting fascism in the theater of memory really is the real deal.
Yeah, I mean, like throughout this series, I've interviewed, you know, people who are human rights attorneys and who are out there like going to war zones and, you know, defending the powerless and actually doing the work. And I'm like, man, what am I doing? Like making my little podcast. And I have to, you know, continually remind myself that like these stories are important. And we as humans search for meaning and try to create meaning out of the things that happen to us. And that's what our job is as a writer, as a podcaster, as a, you know, telling these stories is important because it's the only thing that gives our lives and these sacrifices and these deaths meaning. You know, one of the episodes in the show is about my mom's sister who was killed by one of the death squads. And it really feels like throughout our entire family history, this person, my aunt, died. And it happened in the middle of the war. And so it was never given this importance. Her name was never printed in a newspaper. You know,
What was her name?
Her name was Margarita Lizama.
Mm-hmm.
And there's thousands of people like her whose names never get printed in a newspaper and whose stories never get told. And at the very least, in this small way, I can tell my family, hey, this person was important. Their story mattered.
Mm-hmm. It's Unforgetting. It's that fight against fascism in the theater of memory. It's critical with the rise of fascism, or even without fascism, with climate change alone and the seriously apocalyptic things that are happening around the globe and even in the northern countries. We need the right story that's one of my main points in life, in the classroom, in writing, is the story, helping people think about their story in a certain way so that, I mean, I don't have a bullet in my head because I transform my story from one of self-hatred into one of self-love by understanding my past, as difficult as it was. It's hard to love yourself as a Salvadoreño, to be frank. I mean, like, you have a culture where, a political culture especially, where, for example, as recently as 2007 or 10, there are polls that say that most people supported the exterminación of the gangs as a solution. It's that foundation, that fascistic history in the culture, not in the US only or in El Salvadoran government, but in the culture itself, in our families, like in those right-wing evangelical churches right now. I mean, I have a word for them, it's Cristo Nazis. And I tell my students, look, you saying, Professor, that my family that supports Trump is a fascist? I said, well, I'm not going to call your family fascist, but if it was my family,
Maybe you should.
But yeah, if it was my family, I'd call them fascist. Put it that way.
Yeah.
You know, but That's a story. That's the story.
After a quick break, Roberto and I talk about our shared hatred for the writer Joan Didion and how to reclaim our narratives. We'll be right back. Yeah, well, and a lot of the literature around the Salvadoran Civil War, you see people sort of saying like, well, why are Salvadorans so violent? Well, why is it that these people can't get it together? Why do they love killing each other? And it's like, it completely misses, even in Joan Didion's book, which I read, it was one of the first books I read, and I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, she, at some point she uses like the word savage or barbarian or something. And I was just like, this really is how they tell our stories. And I guess that's how you would interpret it if you didn't know the history of this place and how for generations there has been violence imposed on these people, and it has completely transformed the way that they can operate. Like, violence was the only way that people could operate. They were so deep. It's the textbook definition of generational trauma. And if you don't understand that, then yeah, it's easy to view people as, well, they're just savages. They just love to kill each other.
Joan Didion features in this book. My book,
Yeah.
I see my book as the antidote to the colonizer kind of narration of our stories as Salvadoreños. One of my students discovered that Joan Didion, when she wrote Salvador, did not even speak Spanish. She spent about, and I know from research, she did about 2 weeks, mostly in the air-conditioned rooms of the U.S. Embassy. All the Salvadoran figures in the book are two-dimensional. So as a student of literature, I know when I see a two-dimensional person, they're not really there to be human. So she went to El Salvador and didn't have any Salvadoreño humans in her book. And at the same time, that book gave us what was the most popular phrase to refer to Salvadoreños up until maybe recently, which was, and talk about El Salvador and Salvadoreños, terror is a given of the place. That's why I've written in the San Francisco Chronicle, another place about her, the way I grew up reading her and trying to fit my life into that phrase, like terror is a given of the place. As an undergrad, I was like, wow, that's deep. Joan Didion's deep because she is a deep stylist. But at the level of understanding Salvadoreño culture and history, I eventually woke up. I said, shit, she knows nothing about us. She writes about us two-dimensionally. And that idea that terror is a given of the place is barbaric to do to us in narrative terms. And so that's why I came up with the idea of what my book is really about. And that's terror and love is a given of the place. It's about the terror that survives the tenderness. My book's primarily about the tenderness, like the gaze I give to my driver, Isaias. I don't look at him as just a killer because my experience of him was not just a killer. I meet one of the top level gang leaders of both gangs of 70,000, and I try to show the guy's brilliant. He reads the Spanish Real Academy book of etymology and language for the Spanish language. The guy reads Garcia Marquez, Galeano, and The Hunger Games. He reads voraciously, and he's a killer. His tongue has, at the same time, his tongue can kill somebody at 1 or 2 words, and his tongue can also quote Galeano, and his tongue describes his love of books while reading under candlelight in a maison, in a shanty town. So that kind of complexity you're never going to get from Joan Didion, even though she's a better stylist than me.
Right.
But I got experience on her. She'll never have it. She never did. Even her California is not my California. She writes about California, home to like 30 million Latinos, and she erased us from California history. So whether it's in El Salvador or the U.S., I'm trying to write the antidote to colonizer narratives.
Well, thank you so much for taking this time with me to talk about your book, to share your experience. I mean, it was really a pleasure to read. and definitely a point of inspiration for me making my own series and telling the story of my own family. So it's been a pleasure.
No, my pleasure is mine. You have my fealty to your project because the work you're doing is very important. It's same work I'm doing is unforgetting. Basically, we've excavating, the past to fight fascism and other challenges in the present. So you don't have to thank me. It's my pleasure. And it's I'm honored that my story, my book, and my own story are of interest. So thank you.
Sacred Scandal, Nation of Saints is a production of AHA Podcasts in partnership with iHeart's My Cultura podcast network and is hosted and written by me, Jasmine Romero. Produced by Jasmine Romero with help from Alvaro Céspedes. Research and reporting by Jasmine Romero. Edited by Zaire Quevedo. Nation of Saints was recorded in New York City at the Relic Room with engineering by Brett Tugan. Mixing and sound design by Pachi Quiñones. Original music by Golden Minds, Darko and Aime, based on Patrick Hart's original composition. Fact-checking by Erendira Aquino Ayala. Executive producers are Carmen Graterol, Isaac Lee, Rose Reed, and Nando Villa. Our executive producers at iHeart are Giselle Bances and Arlene Santana. Sacred Scandal was created by Melanie Bartley and Paula Barros. For more podcasts, go to the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts.